I'm Richard Hefner, your host on The Open Mind. My guest today is Claire Sterling, American foreign correspondent who has been based in Italy for 3 decades now, where she has reported on European, African, Mideastern, and Southeast Asian affairs for The Atlantic, New York Times Magazine, Reader's Digest, Harper's, and many other publications. I've asked her here today to discuss the topic of her new book, The Terror Network, which deals with international terrorism and makes considerable reference to a relationship between the Soviet Union and the rampant international terrorism that President Reagan and Secretary of State Haig have recently excoriated. Thanks for joining me today, Claire.
Thank you.
I think that perhaps I'd like to refer to an item that appeared in the New York Times to begin our program. It appeared on February 9th, 1981. And it said that Secretary of State Haig said on January 28th in his first news conference that the Soviet Union, as part of a conscious policy, undertook the training, funding, and equipping of international terrorists. He asserted that Moscow fostered, supported, and expanded that activity. That seems to be the basis for your new book, too. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yes, it is. I should perhaps point out that I finished my book in August before the new administration was elected, let alone installed. So I wasn't exactly an advance man for the Secretary of State, but I think it was a remarkably courageous step for him to take, for Haig and also for the President, to come out publicly and say what I believe every Western government has known for some time, but has been unwilling to say, and has in fact concealed from the public because of the complications of relations with the Soviet Union and the surrogate forces used, I believe, by the Soviet Union to give aid and support, provide the wherewithal to the international terrorist network. I was a little unhappy that when Secretary of State Haig did make the statement, he didn't present along with it a dossier to indicate in what way the Soviet Union was responsible for this kind of assistance, and also that he has not yet indicated the kind of policy that we should now adopt now that we've brought this question out into the open, we, the United States. And there, of course, remains a very large area of difficulty and perhaps great controversy. I might not find myself on the same side of the fence as our Secretary of State once the policy question goes further. Nevertheless, I did welcome, and I do, the fact that that an administration representing the most powerful country in the Western world should have begun to call publicly to the attention of people in this besieged area of the West that there has in fact been, since the middle of the 1960s, more precisely since 1966, what I believe to be a deliberate policy by the Soviet Union not to create, engender, and direct terrorism in its own immediate direct contacts with the terrorists, but to make use of emerging terrorist forces in the democratic countries of Western Europe especially. That is a strategic arc going from Turkey. Iran, of course, is not a democracy, but it was a thoroughly destabilized state by the time this policy was carried out. Turkey, Italy, Spain, Ireland, for Great Britain, West Germany, circling the western side of the continent, and stopping short always at the Soviet frontiers of the continent. That is, the growth of terrorism since 1968, let's say, has struck at the western side of Europe, the side or the western side of the world where the remaining democratic states may be found, but has not once struck at the Soviet side.
Well, you say, it's very interesting to me, you say you're sorry that Secretary of State Haig didn't present a dossier listing, as you do, the various connections between the Soviet Union and terrorism, but that same Times report said that officials with access to United States intelligence services say they have little evidence to substantiate the Secretary's allegation that the Soviet Union trains, equips, and provides funds for international terrorists. Officials in the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the State Department asked to document the Hague charges, said they were unable to do so. There's just no real evidence for it. Now, how do you explain that? That's different from not presenting the evidence.
Yes, quite. Now, I can't explain it, frankly, as I say in the book, because I ran into the same problem while I was gathering the material for this book. As you can see, if you look through the chapter notes, there are 35 pages of documented notes about what I say in this book, and I haven't made any really sensational revelations in this book. I have put together information gathered by traveling as a trained professional reporter, political reporter, through 10 countries, putting together the documentation collected in each country, speaking, yes, with secret services, but certainly not depending on secret services for my information. I don't think even 15 or 20% of the, at most perhaps 20% of the documented sources I cite in this book depend on intelligence sources. They come from sources accessible to the public, from courtroom trials, from confessions of terrorists who have been arrested or who have repented, from interviews given by these terrorists to newspapers in Europe or to Arabic newspapers. Carlos himself has given a most extraordinary, revealing review. The great, celebrated or infamous Carlos the Jackal gave an extraordinary review to an Arab weekly called Al-Watan al-Arabi, in which he himself provided evidence of his own links with the Soviet Union, which intelligence agencies in Washington now seem to know nothing about, which is to me quite baffling, I must say.
Now, if I were a good reporter, as you are,
I hope so,
I wouldn't leave it that way, and I would ask you, but now, what guesses would you make as to the reasons why State Department and the intelligence agencies, even after the Secretary of State has made this charge, say there's no evidence?
Well, I would like to say, first of all, that just to make it clear, there is an enormous amount of evidence indicating, it depends on what question you ask to get the answer, and I have been watching in despair questions being put to the administration and to some of the Russians who have, Russian diplomats who have appeared in a most extraordinary way on American television. I think they must have been stung to the quick by these charges. Since the reporters stop before asking the question that really matters, they're not getting the answers.
What are the questions that matter?
If you say, has the Soviet Union directly aided the development of international terrorism, it is relatively easy for a Soviet spokesman to say no and to defy you to prove to the contrary, because what the Soviet Union has done is it has provided a do-it-yourself kit for terrorist warfare. Kit, instructions included. That is, it has provided the training, it has provided the arms, the protected arms routes, the sanctuary, the protection, the shelter when somebody has to make a fast getaway, a good deal of diplomatic protection. Over the course of 15 years, the know-how, not the money, because very quickly all terrorist groups have learned how to raise their own money in the millions by hijacking and kidnapping and bank robberies. But of course, the technique of hijacking has got to be learned, and that too has been included in this enormous network of training camps that have trained tens of thousands of people, including the major terrorist groups of all Europe and the democracies, as well as the Palestinian forces, which are terrorist forces, because I'm not saying that everybody in the Palestine resistance is a terrorist, but certainly there are open and very guilty terrorist formations. Now, the training has been provided, first in Cuba, then in the Arab arc backing the Palestine resistance from Lebanon and Syria, and for a while Iraq, not so much now, to South Yemen, which is a Soviet satellite state, to Libya, about which we have heard something, but I think not enough, in its relations with the Soviet Union for one thing, and in its $12 billion arms deal with the Soviet Union, and its 20 camps or 30 camps for some 20,000 terrorists at a time within Libya, with the Cubans coming in to provide the most sophisticated training for this guerrilla warfare training, for sabotage, for disguise, for map work, for communications, for karate, for all the techniques of urban guerrilla warfare, for hijacking, kidnapping and so on.
These have been left-wing terrorist
groups. I'm speaking of the left-wing terrorist groups. Right-wing terrorism is an older phenomenon. It was going on through the 60s, has been much written about, and has been, I don't say entirely understood, but at least has had a good deal of exposure in the press. Left-wing terrorism, which developed through the 70s, from 68 onward, has had very little exposure, that is, in a political sense, because so many people have refused to believe that it could be left-wing. They have continued for, that is, in Europe, for example, where you have a very large intellectual left, a legitimate left, I'm not talking about terrorist left, but socialist, social democratic left, intellectuals pride themselves on having leftist views in Europe, and they have, until the last year or two, for the greatest part of them, have refused to believe that a genuine left-wing person can be a terrorist.
Has that been difficult for you to believe?
Yes, it was difficult for me when I started, which is why I felt it was necessary for me to do this book when I began to discover the evidence before me in Italy, which is when I started to move out into other countries. And in Italy, especially where terrorism in the 70s reached such menacing, terrifying levels, until 78 or 79, the left-wing press and left-wing intellectuals kept insisting that these were fascist agents provocateurs who were infiltrating and provoking the terrorism and trying to blame it on the left. And only by the end of the decade has it now become more or less accepted that there is such a thing as left-wing, extreme left-wing terrorism, just as menacing as extreme right-wing terrorism. Every bit as menacing, sharing the objectives of right-wing terrorism, which is primarily the first is the destabilization of democratic governments.
You said that you yourself had difficulty in accepting the fact that this was left-wing terrorism initially, until you began your investigations. Why?
Well, I've always been an anti-fascist. From the time I was in school. The first cause that was important to me in world politics was Spain. For my generation, Spain meant what, for my children's generation, Vietnam meant. And when I went back, and I've been back to Spain many times as a political reporter over the years, for over 20 years, and I was there when Franco died, and I was there again, working for material on this book, watching what happened with the Spanish Basques, who had been my heroes, the first anti-Franco forces I had met when I was a girl fresh out of Columbia University journalism school, just starting out in Europe, and slipped over the border into Spain. The first opposition to Franco I met was in the Basque North, in San Sebastian, my Basque heroes, remaining my heroes, my political heroes, all that time, until I saw what they were doing after Franco died. They fought Franco gloriously all through the period, his 40 years of rule, the present generation included, because he only died 5 years ago. But they killed very little, perhaps 4 or 5 people in all. And their most spectacular assassination was Admiral Carrero Blanco, who was supposed to be the successor to Franco and assure continuity for the regime. And with his death, admittedly, the continuity was broken and the regime died. But what happened is that in the year after Franco died, these same Basque separatists in ETA killed more people in the name of liberty than they had killed in all the 40 years of living under Franco's oppression, under a dictatorial system, a fascist system. And I couldn't understand this phenomenon. I traveled a good deal in Basqueland, and I spoke with Beth, and I watched, and over the next 2 years, 3 years, the escalation of terrorism was terrifying, and it was unmistakable, as I think I show with very strong evidence in the chapter on Spain, that the objective of the Basque Eta Militar was to force a return to a military dictatorship. And alas, we have seen in the last month how close they have come to destroying the fragile structure of democracy in Spain.
And this evidence that you put together is still seemingly not available to our own intelligence agencies, at least in public.
I frankly cannot understand why there should be such resistance among our intelligence agencies to conceding these basic facts. Because, as I say, they're not secrets.
Sterling, what would you, given the fact that the President and the present Secretary of State do recognize what you have recognized and documented in the terror network, what would you suggest American policy be in relation to Soviet-aided terrorism.
Yes, well, of course, I don't think we ought to make war on the Soviet Union because they're helping the terrorists. They, of course, are making war on us by using the terrorists. There's no question. It's an indirect surrogate war, proxy war, if you like, which costs them very little. They have provided the training and the weapons through the Palestinians or the Cubans. They themselves have had very limited direct contact with terrorists, although they have been caught in the act in San Juan de Luz meeting with leaders of Spanish Basque, of the Spanish Basque Eta Militar, only 2 years ago. But apart from that, they have let the others do it, letting the transfer of technology go on, training the Palestinians inside Russia, letting them go back to South Yemen, which is a Soviet satellite, and there train the IRA provisionals, the Italian Red Brigades, the German Baader Meinhof Gang, the Spanish Basques, the Turkish People's Liberation Army, and so on, and so on. It's true that they have thus, in my opinion, been waging a surrogate war on the Western democratic states. But of course, I think it would be suicidal and entirely wrong for us to think in warlike terms of response. I think we must think in political, diplomatic, and economic terms. This must become an important part of our instrument of our diplomatic policy. We must consider it an issue at least as important as the major issues on which we must, I don't say have a Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union, but on which we must deal with the Soviet Union. Therefore, we must understand the role played by our interlocutor if we are to have any prospects of coming out with a successful diplomatic deal of any kind. I should add to that there is, to me, a very serious danger involved also in raising this issue publicly, which is, first of all, to confuse anybody who picks up a gun, to say that anybody who picks up a gun against any regime is a terrorist. I don't agree with this concept. I think there must be some situations. I haven't tried to draw a line, and my inclination after studying the subject as long as I have is to say that anybody who picks up a gun is a terrorist, or at least he's a killer, whether it's the cause looks good or bad, and a killer is a killer, bad or good, it's a killer. Nevertheless, I believe one must be careful in distinguishing situations where one has oppressive right-wing dictatorship with no possibility, no instruments for political expression, no possibility for expressing a political opposition outside of the use of force. And I would like to see an American policy which tries to help in such a situation by averting the use of force. What I would totally disagree with and angrily oppose would be an attempt to use the extreme right to flog the extreme left. I think that could be a tragically mistaken policy.
Don't understand my motives in raising this question, but won't the terror network, the secret war of international terrorism, with all the documentation that you offer of the role that the Soviet Union has played, won't it lead to what you just said you were concerned about? How nervous-making is it for you?
It makes me very nervous to be identified with people who think that we ought to get into South America and pick up any right-wing dictator who's willing to shed a lot of blood in order to crush left-wing opposition. It makes me extremely nervous because I couldn't support such a position.
Yeah, but an awful lot of people are going to read the terror network. An awful lot of people like me will read it and say, my gosh, this is war, as you said yourself.
Right. But the war I'm talking about, first of all, that is, I believe that we must not allow ourselves to be backed into a corner because of the war being waged on us. What the terrorists want most is for us to behave like fascist states. They say so, as I cite over and over again, from Ulrike Meinhof and Andreas Baader to Renato Curcio, who founded the Red Brigade, to the IRA Provisional, all of them. They all say the same thing. They want democratic societies to behave like police states because they believe this will encourage the masses to rise up and make revolution. Of course, historically, nothing could be more tragically misleading and deceptive, self-deceptive, if you like. But that's what they want. And I don't think that's what we should give them. I just don't think we should let ourselves be trapped that way. I believe you can resist terrorist forces within a democratic framework without having to behave like a police state if you fight on political terms as well as police terms. That is, you have to have good police work, obviously, when you're dealing with terrorists, when you define your terms, but you also have to have the kind of political argument that wins the population over to your side.
You want us to say we don't provoke.
We don't provoke.
What will happen if, as some people have estimated, that circle, that line you drew as to the length and breadth of terrorism begins to reach the United States? Is there any reason to assume that it won't?
Oh, no, I think there's a good deal of reason to assume that it will.
Then what will happen?
Well, as I say, we must now watch it. Are we talking about terrorists, or are we talking...
When I'm talking about the situation in South America, for example, I'm talking about, and which I don't discuss in my book, it's not the area I cover, we have several situations in Latin America where brutal right-wing dictatorships are in power, and where there are no political instruments to oppose them, or very few. It's also true in several of these cases that the military regimes have gotten there because of the provocation of left-wing terrorists who have pressed beyond the bounds of legitimate political revolt, as in the case of Uruguay, which is the model. The Tupamaros of Uruguay are the model for every modern terrorist group in the world, and they, in 2 years, destroyed one of the only existing democracies in South America and replaced it with a military dictatorship, which then banned all political parties for the following 15 years. And they were terrorists. For me, they were not liberation fighters, they were terrorists. In democratic countries, where the instruments do exist for political change, where the machinery exists, although it's very difficult, admittedly, and there are many sins and flaws in democratic societies, but nevertheless, where there are the means, peaceful means, to bring about change, people who use violence against the state are, to me, terrorists, whether they come from the right or the left. Therefore, in this country, if it comes to this country, and I hope it doesn't, but I fear greatly that it will, I believe people who use bombs, assassinations, other forms of kneecapping, other forms of military tactics to impose a political will, and they are small minorities representing only themselves in many cases, or very small groups in society, these people must be treated as terrorists. They are not liberation fighters. Like the Puerto Ricans who are Cuban trained in FAUN, who have for years been receiving weapons and training in Cuba, have for years been continuing an attack of violence on this country, and in Puerto Rico represent, I'm sure, less than 5%, as far as I can determine.
Claire Sterling, let me ask this question. In your researches, in your familiarity with the origins of terrorism, what have you unearthed about the likelihood that there will be that kind of action extended in this country? You said you fear it greatly. You fear that it will happen. You hope that it won't.
Yes.
What indications are there that we are a prime target ourselves?
Well, I think that we've been very fortunate in this country in that the Vietnam War was finally ended in one way or another, not perhaps very happily for many of the people concerned. Nevertheless, it was ended and we got out of it. And the great corrosive factor among the young people in this country, the alienating factor that was used, that became the tremendous cause of rebellion on the left, was gone. And for a long time after that, there has been no comparable cause in the United States. The terrorists I'm really concerned about, and those who have had continuing contact with tiny groups since the Vietnam War in America, are the ones I'm talking about come from Europe. I'm talking about terrorist groups of the ultra-left in democratic societies, where there is no problem of liberation, where they don't have a colonial problem, where they are trying to destroy constitutional democratic states. Now, they have maintained contact with small groups of every kind in this country. They could emerge from any set of circumstances. The Basques, because they have an ethnic issue. In Ireland, there's a Catholic-Protestant issue, plus a terrible poverty issue on the Catholic side. In Turkey, you have terrible slums and...
But in the 2 minutes we have remaining, is there any evidence that people are being trained here?
Oh, yes. Well, in the early years of the 70s, Black Panthers, Weathermen, SDS people were being trained in the camps in Cuba, certainly, and to a degree in the Middle East.
With Soviet funds, Soviet help?
Well, the Soviet control is direct over the Cuban DGI, the intelligence service which runs these camps. There's a Soviet colonel sits next to the director of the DGI in Havana, in the office next door, so that has
total surveillance over the training in Cuba. The same goes in South Yemen, which is a Soviet satellite state under total military control of the Soviet Union, where every major terrorist group in the world has been trained in the last 5 or 6 years. And just to conclude, my fears for America are that if we are going into a period of economic difficulty and social tensions, increasing social tensions, whether they be racial or economic, Hispanics, blacks, problems of budget cuts that could arouse certain sentiments, these people will have legitimate grievances, absolutely legitimate, as in these other cases, there are always legitimate grievances. And they will also be peculiarly vulnerable to the kind of penetration and manipulation that we've seen elsewhere by parties which don't have the same cause and are not disinterested parties trying to do something else, as in the case of the Soviet Union, or of groups around the Soviet Union who are trying to press for permanent Marxist revolution.
What do you think will happen in the next year or two?
I think much depends on what happens economically to this country. Certainly in Europe, the pressure points have changed. At the moment, the most serious problem is Spain, I believe, where they have come very close to destroying a fragile new democracy and may actually do it very soon.
Claire Sterling, I do appreciate your joining me today for this discussion. I'll admit it's scary. Must be scary to you.
Yes, it is scary.
It is scary to me. Thanks for talking about it.
Thank you for letting me.
And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope that you, too, will join us again on The Open Mind. Meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck.